The wind moved through Larkspur Ridge like it remembered things the living forgot, names carved into stone, songs never sung again, and the smell of smoke that never truly left. There were certain places where time didn't pass so much as it circled, where every breeze carried an echo, and every silence held a memory. Maggie Callahan stood alone on the ridge above her ranch, her boots firm in cracked soil, watching as a pair of buzzards carved slow arcs in the sky above Coyote Hill. Below them, the raw mounds of earth where her family lay bore no gravestones, just 2 cedar posts, hand-cut and driven into the ground with shaking arms and a will she hadn't realized she still owned. Silas, her husband, had been buried with the wedding medal he always kept tucked in the lining of his vest, and Toby, her boy, with the lopsided map he'd drawn on the back of an old flour sack, one he'd sworn would lead them to a spring he was certain no one else knew about. It hadn't mattered to Maggie whether the map was real. What mattered was that it had been his. Now both were gone, turned to ash in a fire that hadn't burned with the randomness of lightning or the clumsiness of a lantern left too long lit. It had moved like intention, with a hunger that knew what it was after. Folks in Larkspur Ridge whispered that the wind carried accidents, but Maggie knew different. The fire had been no accident. She reached down and brushed her fingertips across the barn's scorched wall, the brittle black edges crumbling like old paper beneath her hand. There had once been a star etched there, Toby's mark, drawn with a chunk of charcoal he'd found in the stovebox. It had been crooked and charming and proud. Now the boards bore only splinters and soot. The town hadn't come to help. They'd come to watch. When the fire was still smoldering, when the barn groaned its last and collapsed inward like a lung losing breath, folks stood up on the hill with arms crossed and eyes shaded. They muttered prayers. None came down. Only Marshal Eli Horner had approached the next day, hat in hand, his face lined not with concern, but fatigue. He hadn't said much, just kicked at the blackened earth, mumbled that these things sometimes happened, and left before Maggie could ask what he meant. She didn't ask any more. Asking implied hope. Hope had no place here now. Back at the ranch, the barn was a carcass of beams and singed metal. The house still stood, though it bore the scent of smoke like it had soaked into the bones. Maggie slept in fits on a narrow cot beside the cold stove, one hand wrapped around her father's old rifle, waking to the ghost sounds of creaking timber and phantom footsteps in the dust. The animals grew restless, her mare stamping in the stall, the hens laying fewer eggs, as if they too felt something prowling just beyond the edge of sense. She tended to the land as best she could. Fences sagged, tools rusted. The well pulley groaned like an old man. There was no one left to share chores with, no voices to bounce off the stone walls but her own mutterings. Still, each morning she forced herself out of bed, forced her boots on, forced herself to live, because surrender would mean handing her land over to the shadows that had already taken her family. Then came the calf. It was a clear dawn, the sky tinged pink over the mesa, when she opened the door to the porch and saw it, laid there like an offering, or a warning. Its belly slit wide, entrails arranged in a rough circle, its hide marked with a single X, carved deep and ragged into the flesh. It hadn't been a coyote or buzzard that did this. This was made by a hand, a cruel, deliberate one. Maggie stared at it for a long while, her breath shallow in her chest, the rifle heavy in her arms. She said nothing, did nothing, not even when a crow landed on the railing and tilted its head to study her, as if waiting for her reaction. When her legs finally moved, she dragged the carcass down into the scrub and buried it herself. No markers this time, just a shovel, sweat, and the stench of something wrong. She didn't ride into town to report it. The marshal wouldn't help. He was no match for the men who did this. And the neighbors? They'd only grow anxious, cast their eyes down. offer nervous condolences without names attached. Maggie would not let herself be made into a story of pity, not when vengeance stirred in her belly like slow-burning coal. A week passed, then another. The storm came in quiet, not with lightning, but with sky the color of old bruises, the kind of storm that hovered and watched before it broke. Maggie had been stacking firewood by the porch, her palms blistered from chopping, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. When she saw movement up on the ridge, at first it was just a shape, a flicker of darker gray against the gathering clouds. A rider. The silhouette moved with the loose sway of a man who'd been on horseback, longer than he'd been on foot, the wind tugging at the tails of his coat. As he descended the slope, his horse picked its way, careful and deliberate, dust rising behind its hooves like fading smoke. Maggie squinted against the breeze and reached slowly for her rifle. He stopped 10 paces from her gate. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was dry gravel, unhurried. "Just need water." She didn't lower the rifle but nodded once toward the trough. He dismounted, no fast movements, and let the horse drink. Then he straightened and looked toward the ruins of the barn. "Fire," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He studied her, not her face so much as her stance, the way she didn't flinch, the way her grip on the rifle was steady, but not fearful. Then he nodded, once, like he'd decided something inside himself. "Got a tarp I could use?" he asked. "Rain's coming heavy." She hesitated. "There's the barn," she said finally. "What's left of it?" "That'll do." He took no more than he needed, rolled out a bedroll on scorched dirt, said not another word. That night, the storm held off. Maggie sat on the porch, rifle across her knees, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of distant rain and scorched wood. In the barn, she heard no movement, no breathing, just the wind scraping the corners of what remained. When dawn came, she found him already awake, already working. He dragged loose fence posts into place, tied wire with quick, clean knots. She watched from the porch as he moved like a man used to silence, used to labor that didn't require thanks. "Don't expect to be paid," she said finally. He didn't stop his work, just shook his head once. "Wasn't. Then why help?" He paused, looking past her to the twin cedar posts on the hill. "Sometimes folks need help more than they admit." That was all he said. They spent the day in mutual wordlessness, the kind that didn't feel heavy. She fetched water. He rebuilt. When the sky finally broke open in the afternoon, they took shelter under a slanted canvas stretched between half-standing rafters. She offered him black coffee and the last heel of bread. He accepted with a quiet nod. "I never caught your name," she said. "You didn't." He didn't give it. She didn't ask again. That night he built a small fire pit near the barn, far from the house, just enough warmth to take the edge off the desert cold. Maggie watched from the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, her rifle nearby but untouched. He sat with his back to the rock wall, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if the fire might answer some question only he had asked. The next morning, the barn was swept clean. Her tools were neatly lined on the porch. No note, no footprints leading toward the house, just a single set of tracks leading out into the canyon's wide mouth. She thought that was the end of it, until 3 nights later, when the wind came sharper, wrong somehow. Her mare stomped and snorted in the stable, hooves restless. Maggie stepped out with a lantern in hand, rifle slung across her shoulder, and saw it. A knife embedded in her doorframe, the hilt smeared with red clay, the blade's edge engraved with the words, "Last Chance." Her fingers closed around the handle. It came loose with a metallic hiss, and when she turned toward the ridge, there he was again. The same rider, silent, motionless. His horse stood as still as a gravestone under starlight. He raised a single hand in the air. No wave, no salute. Then vanished into the dark. "Just need water," the stranger said, his voice dry as dust. Maggie pointed to the trough, but didn't lower the rifle. Something in his eyes told her. He wasn't just passing through. The barn creaked all night, as if arguing with the wind, but the man inside never stirred, not even when coyotes yowled at the moon like they'd lost something too. By morning, the light that fell over the ridge was brittle and silver, touching everything like frost without the cold. Maggie Callahan stood barefoot on her porch, coffee mug warming her hands, her eyes drawn not to the land, but to the quiet shape moving along her broken fence line. The stranger, back again, had returned before dawn. He worked without asking permission. He hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken, hadn't explained where he'd gone after that night on the ridge when the knife had whispered its warning into her doorframe. But there he was now, sleeves rolled, shoulders hunched over the fence like it owed him something. Once, long ago, Silas had told her you could tell a man's worth by how he held a fence post, whether he saw it as work or as a kind of promise. She remembered those words now, unspooling from memory, like a thread she'd forgotten she'd wound around her heart. This man, whoever he was, didn't treat the work like burden or barter. He set posts like it mattered that the line held. Maggie hadn't spoken a word to him since he'd appeared that morning. She just watched. The longer she did, the more certain she felt that this wasn't a drifter, not in the usual sense. He moved with efficiency, like someone used to purpose, the kind who knew the cost of a crooked nail, the kind who'd seen things burn and didn't flinch. By the time the sun climbed high enough to warm the porch rails, she found herself filling 2 mugs of coffee instead of 1. The days since the calf had passed in a strange kind of waiting. There hadn't been another message. But something had shifted in the air, like the silence was holding its breath. Maggie had seen the marshal once, passing by in his creaky buckboard, with his collar damp with sweat and his eyes low. He didn't stop, didn't wave, just disappeared into the dust heading west, the lawman of a town that no longer believed in law. The stranger, by contrast, was steady. He never asked for food, but she found herself setting aside crusts of cornbread and slices of cold bacon anyway. He never asked questions, never offered answers. But slowly, something began to settle between them. Not comfort exactly, but a rhythm. Each morning, she woke to the soft thump of hammer on post, or the squeak of a gate being repaired. Each evening, he left things better than he found them. By the 3rd day, she left a clean rag and a tin of salve on the porch railing. His hands were blistered. By morning, the salve was gone. That evening, as the sun bled down behind the ridge, casting the barn in long streaks of ochre and shadow, they shared coffee under a canvas strung between 2 leaning beams. The barn smelled of old ash and new dust. Wind blew low across the canyon. Maggie sat cross-legged on a split crate, and the stranger leaned against the post with his hat resting on his knee. "You never give a name?" she asked. He looked at her, slow, not startled, then shook his head. "You don't ask much either," he replied. Maggie thought about that. "Talk's cheap. Folks out here have already said more than they mean." He nodded once and sipped the coffee. Neither spoke again until the cup was empty. In town, the silence grew heavier. When Maggie went in for flour and sugar, folks stared longer than they used to. At Mrs. Denny's feed store, the whispering stopped the moment she stepped through the doorway. Behind the counter, Mrs. Denny stiffened, then softened her face into something like concern. "You're still up there alone?" the woman asked. "I'm not alone," Maggie replied. Mrs. Denny's smile faltered. On the way back to her horse, a man Maggie didn't know well, Henry from the dry goods place, muttered, "You letting him live there now?" Maggie stared at him until he looked away. The town didn't need answers. It needed something to talk about. That evening, she found a bundle on her porch. Dried sage, tied with a scrap of red cloth and a stone placed on top. Frontier folk carried old beliefs, warding charms, warnings, blessings wrapped in simple things. Maggie held the bundle for a moment, then tossed it into the fire pit. The smoke curled sharp and bitter. That night she dreamed of fire again. Not the same fire that had taken Silas and Toby, but something older, meaner. In the dream, the barn screamed. She woke to her mare stamping wildly in the stable and the smell of sulfur on the wind. The knife was in the doorframe again. This time it wasn't carved. It was driven deep. The wood cracked around it. The hilt was smeared in red clay. A message, same as before. The words etched into the blade's spine were different now. Last chance. Her breath caught. She stepped back, lantern trembling in her hand. She raised the beam toward the ridge, and her heart stuttered. The rider was there, just beyond the fence line, high on the slope, his horse standing still as stone. The rider didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, wrapped in dark coat and stillness, a ghost, or something worse. He raised one hand, then turned and vanished into the canyon's throat. She stood there until the lantern flickered out. And when the morning came, the stranger was already back, mending the shed hinge, moving with that same deliberate patience, as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't stood beneath stars with her heart thudding like a wild drum. He didn't look at her when she stepped outside, just kept working. She poured coffee, 2 cups. She said nothing about the knife. But when she handed him the mug, his fingers brushed hers, and for the first time, he spoke before she did. "You have enemies?" She looked down at the steam curling from the cup. "Don't we all out here?" He didn't press. He nodded once and drank. From that morning on, he slept with his back to the barn wall, rifle beside him. Maggie noticed his movements were sharper now, his glances longer. When the wind picked up, he stood at the gate and watched the horizon for hours. The days found rhythm again, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't just coexistence, it was a kind of trust that didn't need proving. He taught her how to reload faster, how to shoot in wind, how to use breath and bone to steady her aim. Maggie learned quick. Grief had made her hollow, but also sharp. A woman with nothing left is a woman with nothing to lose, and that kind of clarity made her hands steady. In return, she showed him how to braid rope tight enough to hold a colt, how to dry apple slices over the stove, how to tell which chickens were laying and which were just freeloaders. He didn't compliment, but he stayed. In the evenings, they shared the silence like 2 people sharing a quilt, close, but not touching. She found she didn't mind his quiet. It wasn't the heavy kind that reminded her of loss. It was the solid kind, the kind that steadied her breathing. One night, as coyotes barked in the distance and the last of the sun sank into the bones of the canyon, she swept the porch. The stranger sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, the steel catching the light in brief flickers. The sound was rhythmic, like breathing. "You always travel alone?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Most folks don't follow the kind of work I do." "You a bounty hunter?" He paused, then resumed sharpening. "Something like that." The answer was vague, but it didn't feel like evasion, just boundary. She let it rest. That night she found her tools rearranged again. Not just cleaned, but sharpened. The porch swept. The water trough cleared of algae. He did the work of a man staying. But when she checked the saddle that hung near the barn wall, his was still cinched tight, ready to ride at any moment. It was the not knowing that unsettled her most, not his presence, but the question of how long it would last. By the time dawn painted the hills with rust, He was back, already tightening the hinges on the shed, as if he'd never left. Maggie poured 2 cups of coffee, but only filled 1. The first real warmth of spring brought wildflowers to bloom by the fence, and talk of death galloping in from the hills. Maggie Callahan knelt in the earth, her fingers damp with soil, coaxing green shoots from the ground with more hope than expectation. The wind was softer that morning, laced with the scent of pinyon and dry sage, and for a moment she let herself believe that the land might finally stop grieving. But peace in Larkspur Ridge was a brittle thing. It cracked when you leaned on it. From where she crouched, Maggie could just make out the crooked map her son had drawn years ago, still pinned above the fireplace inside the house. The parchment had browned with time and smoke, its lines faded by heat and tears. On it, near the northwest ridge, he'd scrawled the words, "Bad Man's Camp," in blocky handwriting. She had once laughed at the phrase, called it a child's fantasy. Now, she wasn't so sure. Sometimes children saw things adults ignored. The stranger had taken to riding the outer fence lines in the early hours, coming back with dust on his coat and a certain tension behind his eyes. He didn't say what he saw, and Maggie didn't press. She had learned to read his quiet like a weathered page. The small shift of his jaw, the way he kept his rifle closer than usual. Something was coming. And both of them knew it. Later that afternoon, as the sun threw long gold shadows across the porch and the cicadas began their first tentative buzz, a rider came thundering down the trail in a storm of sweat and panic. The mare was lathered, nostrils flaring, and the boy astride her looked half mad with fright. "Miss Callahan!" he shouted before he even dismounted. "Miss Callahan!" It was Jessie Coe, barely 15, face pale and dust-smeared, eyes wild like he'd seen a ghost and outrun it. Maggie stepped off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The stranger had already appeared from behind the barn, rifle in hand, his expression unreadable. "They're near," Jessie panted, voice cracking. "Up near Badger's Bluff. I heard 'em. Boone Kincaid and his lot. They were drinkin', talkin'. One of 'em said your name, said you needed a lesson." Maggie's spine stiffened. The stranger stepped forward. "How many?" Jessie swallowed. "At least a dozen, maybe more. Camped under the shale cliff. They had pickets." "Didn't see me. I was rabbit hunting up the pass." The stranger nodded once, already turning toward the barn. Maggie laid a hand on Jessie's trembling shoulder. "You done right, son. Now get home. Tell your folks to stay close." The boy nodded and rode off, his horse stumbling with fatigue. As the dust of his departure settled, Maggie turned to the stranger, her jaw tight. "So," she said, "how long do we have?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "We'll need traps." That was all. No comfort, no speech, just a quiet declaration of war. They worked for 2 days straight. The first day, they cleared brush along the fence line and dug out shallow pits lined with sharpened stakes and covered in woven reed mats dusted with topsoil. Oil barrels, 3 of them found half buried behind the old shed, were filled, sealed, and rolled to the top of the northern hill. A rope and peg rig was set, ready to release them with one hard pull. Maggie, though sore and windburnt, moved with focused precision. The stranger showed her how to predict shadow angles, how to conceal a line across open trail so it wouldn't catch light. She followed every instruction, every gesture, until her body hurt in places grief had once claimed. At night, they sat by the dim glow of a hooded lantern inside the barn's skeleton. The canvas roof overhead flapped against the wind, and coyotes sang far off in the canyon. He passed her a tin cup of water, laced with a splash of whiskey. She took it, hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the tension that came before a reckoning. "I used to hate the quiet," she murmured, voice low. "After they died, it was like the whole world held its breath. I thought, if I made enough noise, slammed a door, clanged a pot, maybe it'd come back to life. He didn't speak, just drank and waited. But it didn't, she went on. The noise made it worse, made the emptiness echo. She looked up at him. The silence. It's honest. At least. He met her eyes. Yeah, he said softly. It is. For a while, they just listened to the fire pop and settle. You ever think about leaving? She asked after a long stretch of stillness. He stared out into the dark where the stars pressed low against the horizon. Where would I go? She didn't answer. The question was as much hers as his. If I leave, she said at last, they vanish for good. I can't have that. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw it, the crack behind his stoic mask, the wound not made by bullets or knives, but by something quieter and deeper. I know what that is, he said, holding on to ghosts. Her hand found his on the bench between them. He didn't pull away. That night, while Maggie tried to sleep with the rifle beside her and her boots still on, she woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Light. Careful. She didn't rise. She just listened. The stranger stood out there under the moonlight. Shoulders squared, staring toward the ridge, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. When dawn painted the mesa in dusty amber, Maggie rose before him. She meant to feed the chickens, but found herself instead drawn to the barn. There, beneath his saddle blanket, something caught her eye. A folded square of paper, yellowed and creased, nearly lost in the dark lining. She hesitated, then reached in. The paper was stiff with dust and sweat, the edges curled. When she unfolded it, the ink bled a little under her fingers, but the name printed across the top remained clear. Boone Kincaid. Wanted for murder, arson, extortion. Reward offered by Federal Special Bureau of Justice, seal of the Western Division. Handwritten beside the printed lettering, just below the bounty amount, were two initials, SB. Her breath hitched. She read it twice, then again. The man out there hammering nails into the gate wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a hired hand. He was a federal agent, a tracker, a ghost hunter in Lawman's skin. And he hadn't just happened upon her ranch. He'd come for Boone. He just didn't know the story would end here. She folded the poster with care and slipped it inside her coat. She didn't say a word. Not then. But something in her shifted, not in fear, but in understanding, in the way you see a wound not as weakness, but as truth. Later, as the sky turned bruised with evening and the first flickers of distant thunder danced behind the mountains, he handed her a coil of wire. We'll set the last trap near the well, he said. She didn't ask how he knew Boone would come that way. She just nodded and followed. Maggie tucked the poster inside her coat. She didn't confront him, not with words. But when he handed her a coil of rope, she didn't question him. She just followed. Dawn broke like a drawn breath, long and quiet, too quiet for a place about to bleed. The land lay still beneath a cover of pale gold light. The kind that didn't yet carry warmth but promised heat by noon. Maggie Callahan stood at the upstairs window of her house, her hands wrapped around the barrel of her rifle, eyes on the eastern trail. The air inside the room was dry and sharp with wood smoke from the breakfast fire she hadn't touched. Downstairs, the stranger's shadow moved briefly across the wall, then vanished as he stepped outside. Everything was ready. Every gate strung with wire. Every barrel balanced above the ridge. Every mistake from the past, counted and accounted for. They had done all they could. Now, they waited. The night before, Maggie had stood at her son's old desk, the one salvaged from the ashes, and traced the faded lines of the map he'd drawn in boyish scrawl. Badman's Camp, the Ridge, the hidden spring. Toby had known this land better than most grown men. His fingers had mapped out the bones of the territory that was now bracing for war. Below her window, the land rolled gently, deceptively open. The barn stood at the ready, patched but holding. The wind had died completely. Not a bird sang. The quiet was so complete it made her ears ring. Then came the sound. Horses, 13 of them, kicking up a trail of dust that hung in the early light like smoke before a fire. They didn't sneak in. They didn't ride slow. They came hooting, hollering, reckless in their confidence. Boone Kincaid led them, his silver spurs glinting even from this distance. His mustache curled into a smirk that screamed cruelty, dressed up in swagger. Behind him came his men. Patched coats, crude tattoos, blood already in their teeth. They didn't expect a fight. Larkspur Ridge had taught them not to. Maggie crouched lower, her cheek against the cool wood of the window frame. Her finger settled against the rifle's trigger. Her breathing, though quick, was steady. Below, in the rocks beneath the western ridge, the stranger crouched in position. His long coat blended with the shale. His rifle rested on the ledge, aimed where the trail narrowed. He didn't move, didn't blink. He was wind and stone now. As Kincaid's riders neared the first curve, the trap sprung. A tripwire caught the lead horse's leg. It stumbled, throwing the rider sideways into the dust. Before the others could react, a rope snapped loose from the hill above, releasing 3 barrels slicked in oil. They rolled fast and wild, slamming into horses and men, sowing chaos like lightning through dry brush. One of the gang shouted. Another fired a shot into the air. Then the stranger opened fire. His first shot took a rider clean through the chest. The second dropped another from his saddle, screaming. Panic rippled through the gang as they scrambled for cover, not yet realizing the shooter was high above them, moving between boulders like a ghost. Maggie took her moment. Her first shot struck a man dismounting near the fence. He spun and fell, his revolver dropping into the dust. Another man, thin-bearded, eyes too wide, ran toward the barn. But his feet found the pit she and the stranger had dug the night before. With a yelp, he vanished, his scream cut short by the wet crunch of wood and bone. "Spread out!" Boone roared. "Burn it all!" He flung a torch toward the barn. It arced like a comet and struck the dry wood with a burst of flame. Maggie's heart seized. Not again. She bolted from the window and ran, rifle in one hand, a soaked blanket in the other. Smoke rose in plumes, thick and black, stinging her eyes as she slammed the wet cloth against the flames. Embers hissed and popped. Her lungs burned, her arms ached, but she didn't stop. A rider charged through the smoke, pistol raised. Maggie ducked, half blind, bracing herself. But the stranger appeared from the fire's edge like judgment itself. He didn't shout, didn't waste a word. His revolver barked once, clean and final. The rider collapsed at Maggie's feet. Behind them, gunfire still cracked through the canyon. 2 of Boone's men were already turning tail, bleeding and scared. One tried to shout something, but a third shot from the ridge caught him. In the weeks that followed, the silence changed. Not the empty kind, but the kind that fills a room like morning light through lace curtains. Maggie Callahan noticed it first, in the way the wind no longer felt like a warning. The air around Larkspur Ridge had softened. It still carried grit and dust, but not menace. She sat one morning on her porch, sewing a torn sleeve, listening as the chickens clucked and scratched. Their sounds didn't feel distant anymore. They felt real, grounded, the kind of noise that belongs to the living. Inside, beside the hearth, a tin box now rested beneath Toby's old map. Letters lay folded within, clean, marked with a wax seal, and all written in a strong, unadorned hand. She had read each one twice. The first bore the seal of the Bureau. It said Boone Kincaid had been tried and hanged at dawn in Carson City, witnessed by 3. A just end for a man who'd left only ruin in his wake. His brothers had been sentenced to life. Others had scattered. Ghosts now. Maggie had not traveled to Carson to see it happen. She hadn't needed to. The law had spoken, her way. Not hot and fast through a rifle barrel, but quiet and final through ink and rope. She had kept the letters not because she needed proof, but because she liked the way they felt in her hand. Steady. Permanent. In a life that had known too much erasure, permanence was rare. The town had changed, too. Slowly, like a mule learning to trust again. Mrs. Denny stopped glaring when Maggie walked past. Jessie Coe started leaving rabbit pelts by the gate. Even Marshal Horner nodded once when they crossed paths, though whether it was apology or relief, she couldn't say. The barn still bore blackened boards, but the roof no longer leaked. The fields had sprouted tentative green. Wildflowers bloomed again along the western fence line. Bluebells, larkspur, and tiny yellow blossoms that Toby used to call sun thumbs. Then one morning, just as she was bending over to tend the new garden row, Maggie saw a silhouette moving down the trail. No thunder of hooves, no call, just a single rider moving slow through the haze of spring light. His horse walked easy. His coat hung familiar. He didn't dismount at first, just rode up, tied the reins like he'd done it every morning of his life, and waited. Maggie stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The stranger looked at her across the yard, his eyes steady, the barest lift at the edge of his mouth. "You done chasing?" she asked. He tilted his head, sun catching the faint smile at the corner of his lips. "For now." She nodded. That night, he slept inside, not in the barn, not on the porch, in the house. He laid his bedroll near the fireplace without ceremony, unbuckled his belt, set his revolver beside his boots. Maggie didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The house took him in like a long-missing piece of itself. In the quiet between dinner and dawn, she listened to his breathing. It was steady, deep. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sound of another soul sleeping nearby. The next few days passed in a new kind of quiet, one that didn't press against her ribs, but filled them. He helped mend the outer fencing, carried feed, reinforced the barn doors. He brought back supplies from town without asking, left a sack of new nails by the porch, tacked fresh oilcloth over the windows, fixed the squeaky floorboard in the hallway, and one evening, after they'd eaten stew and split a bottle of rye, he handed her a wrapped parcel, small and heavy. She opened it carefully. Inside was a pendant, iron dark and smooth, shaped like a hawk mid-flight. The edges had been filed clean. The wings spread wide as if braced against the wind. "Elk iron," he said. "Forged it myself. Thought it'd suit you." Maggie turned it over in her hand, feeling the weight, the warmth. "Why a hawk?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes calm. "You see everything, even when you're hurting. You don't miss a thing." She said nothing, just lifted the cord and placed it around her neck. She wore it from then on. The pendant became her talisman. She touched it in the morning before lifting the rifle from its perch. She held it when she watched the sun burn down across the horizon. She traced its wings when words refused to come. They didn't speak of love. That wasn't their way. But it was in the things they did. The way he laid out her tools without her asking. The way she left an extra biscuit in the tin. The way their silences aligned like two rivers flowing in the same direction. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sky bloom with orange and violet, she laughed. It startled them both. It wasn't a big laugh, just a small cracked thing that shook loose from her chest like dust from a worn quilt. He looked at her and didn't smile, but something in his eyes warmed, "I haven't heard that sound in a long while," he said. I hadn't either. Later that night, as the air cooled and stars unfolded over the ridge, she found herself humming. A soft tune. Barely there. She stopped mid-note, surprised by the sound. The stranger looked up from where he was whittling a piece of wood. "That song, you knew?" She shook her head. "I think I used to sing it to my boy." He didn't press, just nodded and returned to the blade. On the 6th night after his return, as thunder grumbled somewhere beyond the mountains and the scent of rain came riding the wind, she asked the question that had lived in her throat since the siege ended. "Do you ever think about staying?" He didn't answer right away, just leaned back, arms crossed, boots up on the railing. "I do," he said finally, "but I'm not sure the world's done needing me elsewhere." Maggie nodded. Her heart didn't leap. It simply breathed. "And if it calls again?" "I'll ride. I always ride." She looked out at the land, the stubborn soil, the crooked fence posts, the trees bent by years of wind, and felt something settle deep inside her. "You better come back." He didn't promise, but he didn't leave that night either. He looked at her across the soft amber of the lantern and said, "I forged it for you. Hawks don't miss much, and neither do you." Somewhere between planting the last peach tree and stitching up Jessie Coe's torn trousers, Maggie realized she hadn't reached for her rifle in days. The thought came quiet, not triumphant, but curious, like a bird landing on a windowsill and tilting its head. The rifle still stood in its usual corner by the front door, oiled, loaded, ready, but its presence no longer pressed on her like a question that needed answering. Larkspur Ridge had grown quieter, not in the hollow way it once had, but in the way a place rests after something has finally broken loose. Dust still blew through the streets, and the post office still leaned westward like it couldn't quite stand up straight. But people came out more now. Doors opened. Window panes were washed. Children's voices carried down from the hills. The garden Maggie kept behind the barn had begun to take root in earnest. Cornstalks swayed like dancers in the wind. Sunflowers turned their faces east each morning. The peach saplings she planted along the fence line bore no fruit yet, but they stood upright, proud. And the stranger, he stayed, not just in body, but in rhythm. He moved through the ranch like someone who'd always belonged there. He repaired a broken hinge on the chicken coop, whittled handles for tools Maggie hadn't touched in years, brought back coffee and boots from town without being asked. He taught Jessie and 2 other boys how to shoot clean and straight, not with bravado, but with respect. He spoke little, but when he did, the words settled deep, like fence posts driven right. Maggie had married once before in the small clapboard church outside of dry Cedar Bluff town, where the floor creaked and the candles smoked. That wedding had been soft-spoken, full of youth and trembling hands, but this one, when it came, was even quieter. They were married beneath the cottonwood tree at the back of her property, just after the first leaves turned yellow at the edges. No preacher from town came, not that she'd asked one. The stranger spoke his vows in a voice low enough to be mistaken for a prayer, and she answered with the same quiet conviction. There were no rings, just hands, calloused and warm, clasped together beneath a sky full of patient wind. He never gave his full name, not even to the few witnesses from town, Mrs. Denny, Jessie Coe, and an old trader who had once fought in the war and who carried the scent of cedar and pipe tobacco. But none of them asked for more. They knew who he was, the man who had ridden in when fire threatened, the man who had stayed when the ashes cooled. Maggie kept the hawk pendant around her neck. She wore it over her blouse, the iron warm from her skin. It had become a part of her, a symbol not of him, but of herself, of what she had seen, what she had survived, and what she had chosen to become. One morning, as she folded fresh linens and laid them in the trunk beneath the bedroom window, she paused with a cloth in hand. Outside, the children were laughing. Someone had dropped a pail. The clang echoed. It didn't jolt her the way it used to. The stranger, her husband now, was repairing a wheel on the supply cart. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, back bent, hair streaked with dust and silver. He glanced up once, catching her eye, then returned to his task without a word. That small exchange held more than 100 letters ever could. In town, folks no longer whispered when she walked by. They nodded. Some even smiled. The woman who once stood alone beside the graves on the hill was now the one who stitched dresses for neighbor girls and brought fresh eggs to the widow down by the ravine. She wasn't the widow anymore. She was just Maggie, herself again. The upright piano inside the house remained untouched. She had dusted it, polished the keys, even lit a candle atop its lid once. But she never played. The silence it kept was one of respect, not sorrow. Near the barn, a small shelf had been nailed into the wall. On it sat 3 objects: Toby's map, rolled and tied with twine, the old army medal Silas had carried, and the hawk pendant's original cloth wrapping, folded into a neat square. One evening, as the sun burned low and the fields turned to gold, Maggie sat beside her husband on the porch. The day's heat still clung to the steps. The chickens had settled. Coyotes barked in the far distance. A lantern glowed behind the screen door. She leaned against his shoulder, her fingers curled around his forearm. "You ever miss the road?" she asked softly. He didn't answer at once, just reached for her hand, pulled it gently to his chest, and traced the shape of the hawk beneath her collarbone. "Only when I'm not beside you." They didn't speak again that night. The silence between them was no longer distance. It was presence. It was breath and memory and promise. Inside, a tin box rested beneath Toby's map. It still held the bounty letter, and the court verdicts, and the first letter he ever left her, the one written without ink, without paper, but in the way he stacked her tools and swept her porch. Some nights, long after the stars had settled into their proper places and the coyotes had grown tired of calling, she would lie beside him and listen. Not for danger, not for footsteps or fire, just for his breathing, steady and true. And she'd remember. She'd remember the silence that had once felt like grief, and know it now as something else entirely. And in that quiet place, where fire once scorched everything she loved, Maggie Callahan, widow, fighter, root and flame, finally slept without dreams of ash. Sometimes, when the wind slips low across the high desert, you can still hear the faint creak of a gate swinging on rusted hinges, or the soft click of boot heels on dry porch wood, and in those sounds lives the memory of what was left behind. Not the ruin, but the rising after, not the fire, but the roots that took hold beneath its ash. And maybe that's the way life marks the good ones, not in thunder, but in stillness. Not in shouts, but in the quiet hands that build again where something was lost. For there are places in this world where silence speaks louder than law, and where a hawk pendant worn close to the heart carries more weight than any name ever carved in stone. And if you listen just right, beneath the rustle of cottonwoods and the far-off song of coyotes, you might feel her presence. That woman who once stood in the ruins of her life, with blistered hands and a rifle at her side, and who chose not revenge, but roots, not fury, but truth, and the man beside her, quiet, steady, unnamed, who taught her that sometimes you don't have to speak a promise to keep it, that sometimes staying is the loudest vow of all. And it's the little things that echo longest, the folding of a letter into a tin box, the way a mare stomps once in the barn before a storm, the hush of twilight over a garden that never used to grow, the hush of 2 souls finally at peace. And you think of that barn, how it once burned and then was rebuilt beam by beam, with no need for witnesses or blueprints, Just memory and sweat and a pair of hands that had seen too much loss to ever waste a single nail. And maybe you remember the way she laughed once, startled by the sound, or how she hummed a tune she didn't even know she'd remembered, and how he looked at her in that moment like he was watching the whole world rise up again through her, not as it had been, but as it could be. And maybe there's something in that for the rest of us, something about how honor can be buried beneath flame and grief and dust. But it doesn't rot, and if you dig deep enough, if you're willing to bleed for it, you can find it still breathing under the soil, waiting for the right hands to lift it up again. And if justice comes late, it still matters, maybe more so for its waiting. Maybe more so for the way it makes the guilty look over their shoulder in every quiet town they thought they'd broken. And if you've ever thought the forgotten woman had no strength left in her, think again. For sometimes it's the woman who doesn't speak, who doesn't plead, who doesn't beg for kindness, who ends up holding the line not just for herself but for everyone else, watching from behind shuttered windows. Because that kind of grace doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives in the setting of coffee for two, in the teaching of young boys how to shoot straight and speak softer, in the planting of peach trees along a fence line scarred by fire. And maybe the town forgot her once, but they won't forget her now. And even if her name never graces a history book, it'll live in the way the porch light stays lit a little longer, in the way the wind feels safer near the ridge, in the way the children say, "Ma'am," when they pass her gate. And if that's not justice, if that's not love, if that's not the very breath of redemption itself, then maybe we've all been looking in the wrong places. And maybe the truth don't need everyone to believe it. It just needs someone to carry it, like a map drawn by a child's hand or a hawk wrought from iron and given in silence. And maybe, just maybe, we'd all do well to remember that in the end, it wasn't the bullet that settled the story, but the woman who chose the law, the woman who chose the long road of healing, who could have burned the past to ash, but instead made room for something to grow. And if that still means something to you, if you too believe that a life can begin again after all seems lost, that a name doesn't need to be known to be noble, that love can arrive like rain after drought, then leave behind a sign, a small kindness, a quiet gesture, or even just a moment of listening to the wind. And if you felt that, deep down, if your heart stirred like a door creaking open to let the light back in, then let it be known by offering your voice to ours, by joining our stories on this trail, by subscribing to our channel, so you'll be there to hear the next one when it rides in slow across the prairie, wrapped in silence, saddled with memory, and warmed by the fire that never quite went out.